When I went to graduate school, I was interested in both gender and science. I came from a feminist perspective, and one of my dissertation directors suggested that I look at the history of the people who had been labeled hermaphrodites in the 1800s. And the reason that period was interesting was that that was a time when women were agitating for their rights, when gay and lesbian people began agitating for their rights. And the idea was that politically, the division into the two sexes occurred because there was a natural division. So if you had somebody whose body naturally challenged that division, that became really interesting socially and politically. So I went into that area because of that. And then I ended up getting into the intersex rights movement because as I published that work, people who had been born with those conditions contacted me and asked me to help them in their movement. I think where the perspective of history and philosophy becomes useful in medical practice is that we tend to come with a sort of broader perspective on how to think about things. So one of the problems within medical practice with regard to intersex treatment has been a failure of epistemology. And epistemology is the idea of how we know what we know or don't know what we don't know. And one of the problems within medical practice often is that doctors don't think enough about what they know and what they don't know. So that philosophical background helped a lot, but the historical background especially helped because the assumption was that the way intersex was being treated today had to be the way it was, that it was inevitable that this is where we would go and this is the way modern treatment would be. And using history, I could show them that there had been other paths taken. And some of the doctors I worked with actually said that once they learned the history, they realized this was a road that had been taken because of a bunch of different contingencies, and it could be different. When I went to graduate school, it wasn't my intention to do medical activism. And I really got into that because of the work that I was doing with my dissertation work and having people with intersex conditions contact me and ask me to join the intersex patient rights movement. And so I ended up sort of dual tracking, doing activism, but also doing traditional scholarship at the same time. And those fed off of each other. As it turned out, I kept doing that, mostly because social justice has always been a big issue for me in terms of thinking about where my work should go. I'm interested in using the kind of work that I do to try to make people's lives better. And when I think about whose lives need to be better, it's people on the margins who are being oppressed by various systems that could be changed. So I've tended in my work to try to target my scholarship to thinking about justice issues, but not to let the justice issues rule the scholarship or the scholarship rule the justice issues, to try to do both at once. I actually come from an activist background. My parents were conservative and are conservative Catholics, and they are right-to-life activists. And so I was brought up to be an activist, although I'm now a feminist pro-choice person. But I really came from that background, and my mother was a strong feminist. There was actually a group then, I think they still exist now, in the 1970s, called Feminists for Life, and her perspective on anti-abortion politics was very much informed by a feminist perspective, with the idea that men were the cause of pregnancies, men were doing abortions, men were the problem in women's lives, and women needed to take back their bodies and take back their lives. So I kept the feminism, but I went in the direction of pro-choice in terms of my abortion politics. There are times where trying to do scholarship and activism becomes difficult because they feel opposed to each other. And in the book I just published, Galileo's Middle Finger, I really come down on the side of the idea that if you primarily think of yourself as a scholar, you really have to go where the data takes you. And sometimes the data will take you in places where the activism doesn't match, where the idea that you've had, an ideological idea, a political idea, doesn't really match what the evidence is telling you. So in moments like that, it can become difficult. But I think that if at the end of the day what you believe is that good social policy has to be based on evidence, then you're going to go with the scholarship, which is what I've done in my own life. That does, of course, open you up to criticism from activists who feel sometimes that the scholarship is undermining the cause. But I think in the long cause, it's always best if we have the facts straight before we figure out what policy should be. When I worked with activists within the intersex rights movement, there was a lot of attention to evidence and a lot of attention to the pursuit of evidence. And that's because we were convinced and remain convinced that if the physicians gathered adequate data about what had happened from the treatments they were doing on children, that they would find, as we believed we were finding in the adult population, that a lot of people had been harmed, that it was not a safe system, it was not an efficacious system, and that it wasn't ultimately a necessary system either, that in fact children could be raised as boys and girls and have their bodies left intact until they decided for themselves if they wanted to change their bodies. So in the book Galileo's Middle Finger, the idea of looking for evidence became really important to me, because I think that if you're going to go in the direction of trying to argue about what policy should be, whether that's medical policy or environmental policy or legal policy or whatever it is, that you really have to know what is true before you can figure out what is right in terms of the policy. And we really saw that with the intersex rights movement, where we really found that if the physicians bothered to gather the data that we were seeing out in the world, that they found that there were problems with necessity and safety and efficacy of the treatments that they were doing. So I think in the book, the reason I argue that it's so important to pursue this is because I don't actually believe you can have successful justice movements if you don't have the search for truth. If you don't seek out evidence, you're not going to have sustainable social justice. And at the same time, you can't have social justice you can't have truth-seeking if you don't have a just system where researchers can be safe. So in the book, I try to argue that the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of justice are dependent on each other, and that you have to pay attention to both of them at the same time. They should not be oppositional. They should be understood as feeding off of each other in terms of a healthy American democracy. As I worked on Galileo's Middle Finger, one of the things that really disturbed me was when I would hit pockets of academia where evidence didn't matter, where the idea that somebody was championing a cause of some marginalized group was so important that we didn't need to worry about whether or not what they were saying was true. And I found that extremely disturbing, and I think that there are pockets of that within academia, and that we really have to pay a lot of attention to that, because I think that's an insidious system where if what we're doing there is not really scholarship but really pure ideology, what we're saying basically is that the spaces that we've created on university campuses are places primarily of ideology and not of scholarship. And I think, universities are the last place for a lot of the kind of hard work we have to do in democracy. The investigative journalism system is collapsing in the United States because the internet has made it so that people don't pay for news anymore. And as a consequence, we have very little news compared to what we had 20 years ago. When we see that, what has to pick up the slack often is academics doing the kinds of work that journalists used to do, the long-form investigations, the kind of truth-seeking. So it's really important that academics recognize that they have this really crucial role within the democratic system. And if what we do is end up simply championing our cause, waving our flags over and over again without actually looking at the world, without looking for new information, without engaging with texts historically, in terms of literary analysis, philosophically, in terms of the social sciences, or even in terms of the natural sciences, if we don't do that vigorous engagement, then we really are just another bunch of pundits. And there's no reason for us to have a special place in the world. There's no reason for us to have tenure and protection. I think those kinds of things really matter to the health of American democracy. And I try in the book to very much call on American academics to recognize the importance of their place to our democratic system, that the reason to protect ourselves isn't just to protect ourselves and to protect our students' ability to learn and to research. It's also because it's good for the rest of the nation. Academic freedom is a mess in the United States today. We see tenured faculty being fired, for example, for challenging their university presidents or for saying something challenging in class. We see situations where universities set up so-called free speech zones, which are special places where you're allowed to say and think anything you want, but elsewhere you're not allowed to do that. We also find situations like my own where my dean censored my work because he was afraid it had violated a branding agreement with the corporation that owns the hospital that my medical school was engaged with. We see these attacks all over the place in various universities. There's been situations where conservative political governments in the state have come in and basically shut down programs that they find to be too left-leaning. We've seen leftists challenging various people who have ideas that they think are violating their concept of being able to go forward. So people using Title IX to shut things down. So academic freedom today in America is really under assault in many different directions. And I think we really need a renewed attention to that. We really have to do something before we continue to have this erosion away, because as long as we're going in this model that increasingly sees universities as corporations and has branding agreements and branding concepts and treating students as if they're customers and thinking all about the successful academic being the one who brings the most money in, that's just another corporate system that has nothing special about it. Academic freedom, by its very nature, is the opposite of a brand. It's the opposite of a single message. It's the opposite of a corporation, because it's the tolerance of many different diverse ideas, including dangerous ideas. And so it's really, really important that that we renew our commitment to academic freedom, and that we put up with people who may irritate us sometimes as part of the cost of that, try to hold each other to being responsible. But I think responsibility includes thinking about facts, thinking about the ways in which we have to allow others to speak. But we really need to, I think, lean heavily right now in the direction of freedom.